So gelatin sheets, we need to make sure that they're hydrated before we start. So we want to make sure we have a bowl of ice, and then we'll add clean water to it, remember. And then what I want you to do is we're only going to start with the 8 sheets for the Bavarian. I do not want you doing the sheets for the glissage yet, okay? Because as the gelatin sheets sit in the water, they will start to break down. Making sure that we keep it in ice helps to reduce it, but it still will start to break down. So you don't want to put these in too far ahead. But we can do the 8 sheets. Make sure you separate them. If you hold them together, push them in the water, they're just going to gel together, and then it'll be hard to get apart. So when you first do this, you're going to have, they're going to still stick out. So after I get done showing you how to do the cake, I'm going to go back and make sure they are all completely in the ice water. So they're kind of like pasta. Once when the pasta starts to cook, it loosens up, right? You can get it down in there. I want to make sure you understand the importance of that document, and what it's there for is it's not really for me, it's for you when you start to put things together so you don't miss steps and to help keep you on track. Also to make sure that you don't make your Bavarian before you put your mold together, because you're going to see why that's so important in a moment. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do, you're going to trim off the bottom edge to remove the brown. It doesn't have to be all gone, but we just want that crust gone. Okay, it's going to help with the flavor and the visual appearance of the Bavarian at the end. Next, I want you to then flip it back over. Notice I started with the bottom side, right? And then I want this cake, and that's part of your criteria, that it's not more than a half an inch. Okay, your pinky is about a half an inch from the outside to the inside. That's about a half an inch. Okay, so what I want you to do is you're going to lower your head and trim a half an inch of cake. Okay? Now the reason why we use gouache for this is because it holds up really well, and it cuts and lets you shape it easily. Okay? So you should easily be able to get that half-inch layer cake. Alright? Now you know why Chef Stamp made you practice cutting cake so much. This is why. So it's not your first time. Alright, so we're going to hold on to that. You're going to take the ring mold, and you're going to press and cut off the edges of the cake so that the cake now fits inside the ring mold. And then that's how you get rid of the crust from the edges. Okay? So you let it do the work for you. Some of you guys have patterns. I don't think anybody in here did 3D molds, but you did the white stencil, right? And so your white stencils have a pattern to them. So this cake is very thin, and it will dry out quickly, so don't unwrap it until you're ready to use it. Keep that in mind always whenever you're working with cakes. If you're unwrapping them, they're going stale, which is going to make them more difficult to work with. So don't unwrap before you need it. What I want you to do, remember we talked about this when we made it. We're going to do 2 long strips, right? So you don't need the whole thing. So choose the prettiest parts of the cake. Okay? So what we're going to start with, and mine actually got a little crunchy on the edges. See how it's falling apart? That's okay, but what I want you to do is get rid of that cardboard first. So if you got parts that are a little crispy, don't use them. And then cut a nice straight line. Make sure you're only cutting the cake, not the table. And sort of move that. You're going to take your piece of acetate. And what we want is for the japon, when we layer it, we want the japon to come up and leave about a half inch at the top. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're gonna lay the acetate so that there's a 1/2 inch overlay. So this is the end of my acetate. So this is the end of my acetate, and there's my Jacqueline biscuit. So I have about a 1/2 inch or about a pinky height. Okay? And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna leave my acetate there. And I'm gonna use this to help me do a straight line. Okay? And then pick that up, and then I'm going to take this piece of cake, lay it on top. And then use that as my guide, because it's easier to see this cake than it is the acetate. Alright, so this is the cake we're going to use, and then the rest is all extra. So if you had issues with your cake, don't worry about it, okay? Now, if you had a pattern, you don't want to just hack it in the middle or anything, okay? So, like if you have dots or little ovals or anything like that, or stars, what you're going to do is figure out what makes sense. So you don't want to cut it in the middle of the stencil. What you'll want to do is figure it out. So like on this one, they should have cut it like at the top here and at the bottom here. Okay, and now what that gave them was something that had a bigger gap, which is okay, all right? But you just want to try to have it up as much as you can. But if it comes to the, or maybe if we go, that is a little bit closer to do the design like this. So just figure out what works for your pattern and what you've done. So if you got dots, you shouldn't be cutting in the middle of the dots. Okay, so figure out how many dots you need to go up for it to be correct. And either go up or under, do a whole dot, not a half a dot. You understand what I'm saying? Okay. Any questions about pattern? Yes. Correct. 1/2 inch shorter than the acetate. You guys should be writing this down because you're going to be doing it all on your own later. Yeah. We're going to take our ring mold. We're going to put our acetate inside. And one of these pieces of cake, you want to make sure you trim both ends. Okay? Straight up and down, and make sure it looks pretty. You want to pay attention, so my acetate overlaps inside my ring mold. Okay? So you want to pay attention to the inside overlap. And what you're going to do is you're going to start with your cake to line up with the inside overlap. All right? So be careful with this because it will break. So this is the inside overlap, and I'm going to line up my cake with that. Now the reason for doing this is because when I get my second piece of Jacqueline biscuit in here, it's going to allow it to slide, and it'll give me a little bit of a buffer, okay? So with the second piece, what you're going to do is I got a space like from here to here that's a gap. You see it? Okay? So I want to cut my piece of cake longer than that. All right? So I'm just going to start by trimming one end because you always want to have pretty sides meeting pretty sides, right? And then I'm going to guesstimate longer. I'll put that aside. And then what I'm going to do, if you can make the pattern line up, that's great, but you can't always do that. So what I'm going to do is line up the side. So over here is my overlap acetate end, right? So I'm going to start with the cake on the other side and have the overlap of the cake the same side as the overlap of the acetate. And then I'm going to put it in there, and then I'm going to cut this about a 1/2 inch too long. And then because I have this on that acetate, it's gonna make it easy for me to pull back the Jacombe biscuit and to let it squeeze in there. Okay? This should be so tightly in there that if I hold on to just the acetate and the metal ring, I could pick it up. It shouldn't fall out. Okay? You're gonna take the genoise, and we want to trim off just a little bit because we want it to be a little bit smaller because we got all of this acetate or all the Jacombe biscuit taking up a little bit more space, right? So not too much because we prefer not to have gaps. But like 1/8 of an inch, just go around and trim just a smidgen off. You're gonna move your ring mold onto your cake board, making sure you're holding onto the acetate and the ring mold, not just one or the other. You're gonna take your cake, put it down inside, and what we're looking for is for it to be nice and flat. Okay? So I'm gonna kind of pull the genoise back, and I'm gonna make sure that it's nice and level in there. That simple syrup that you made, the sugar and water where you took just a half a cup of that disposable, right? Okay, so generously soak your genoise with the simple syrup. Genoise tends to be rather dry, okay? So we're gonna be rather generous just to make sure that we have a moist cake, not a dry cake, okay? Once you're done with that, pull it out, place the cake in the middle, wrap it up, and just let it sit on your table. Is we're gonna take the heavy cream, we're gonna take our vanilla bean, and we're scraping it, we cut it in half already, and now what we're gonna do is we're gonna scrape the seeds out from the pod. And then we're gonna add the pod and the seeds into the cream to get the maximum flavor from there, okay? So I'm gonna scald that. I've whisked together my egg yolks and my sugar until I saw a color change. This way the proteins are more ready to absorb the hot liquid when we add it. And then I have my cold heavy cream. Why is it important that the heavy cream be cold? What? So to whip. Why does it need to be cold to whip? The fat. So when the heavy cream is cold, the cold fat will hold the air bubbles so that we'll get a nice whipped cream. Okay? That's why you can't whip milk, because milk doesn't have enough fat in it. Alright? And you can't whip hot cream. It has to be cold. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna put this on the mixer. We're going to turn it on medium, and we're going to whip it to soft peaks. So the reason for medium is because it'll give us a little bit more stable of an air structure that we want. Okay, be careful not to over whip it. What happens if you over whip cream? You make butter. Okay. I made that question just for you, James. All right, so about 5 or 6. And then as this warms up, you'll see all the fat will start to melt. My cream and whisk it. Break up the vanilla bean that's in there. I'm going to form it to a circle so I can put my egg yolks on there with my sugar. And I'm going to slowly add my liquid to my yolks. And why are we doing this? So we don't scramble our eggs. Okay, we don't want to overcook them. So we want to add it slowly. And then we want to make sure that we get all of our vanilla beans out of there. And then we're going to make a double boiler. So add about 1 inch of water. So I'm going to bring my water to a boil. why only an inch? Why not fill it halfway up? The reason is you don't want the water to touch the bowl. But we need enough water to create steam, and the steam is what's going to cook our creme anglaise, okay? So we're going to bring that to boil. So notice this is the raspberry Bavarian. We are only cooking the cream. We are not cooking the puree, all right? The puree is not in the mix yet. So my water came to boil. I'm going to turn this down. And now I'm going to cook this to what temperature? 175, okay? So what's happening while it's cooking? Once we get to 130, we're cooking it hot enough so that we kill some bacteria, okay? So for sanitation reasons, it can stop at 130, but we're going to 175 because we're going to use this as part of our thickener, and we want it to cook the eggs, and the eggs to thicken a little bit, okay? What happens if I cook this up to 190 degrees? It's going to get too thick. I'm going to have scrambled eggs. Okay, so make sure you don't overcook it. Make sure you have a thermometer. So what would happen if I just left my creme anglaise sitting on here cooking without moving it at all? The bottoms will scramble, okay? So this is called a stirred custard because you're constantly stirring it, okay? So a stirred custard is going to be fluid. All right, this has such a small amount of liquid, it won't take too long to get it to 175. So as long as you bring that water to boil, when you put the bowl on, you know you're creating steam, right? And it's cooking, so it shouldn't take too long. So I hit it on 20 to bring it to boil, and then it's on 5 now for cooking, okay? All right, so I'm at 175. So I'm going to turn off my water, take off my creme anglaise. I'm going to take my pre-soaked gelatin sheets, and this is starting to get thick, and it's going to go where you're starting to see it get thick to being done rather quickly, so keep an eye on it, okay? So I'm going to take my 4 gelatin sheets, 1, 2, squeeze out the excess water, and then put it in the creme anglaise to melt. So we're going to stir it, and then once when it looks like it's melted, we're going to let it set for a minute longer. So for the heavy cream, once when it starts to lift and it doesn't stay flat, you're pretty close to being there. So, right, it went from being smooth to being a little rough. And then what you're looking for is it to hold onto the whip, but not to be over whipped. You don't want it to look curdled or like butter, okay? All right, so once when your gelatin sheets have sat into the cream for a bit, to make sure they're melted, you're gonna add the raspberry puree. All right, so you're gonna stir in the puree, all right? So the reason for the puree not being cooked is it's going to help the color, and it's going to be a little bit brighter. If we cook the puree, it's going to turn it kind of gray and a dull color. So it's still kind of gray already because we added it with eggs, but it just helps keep the flavor and the color a little bit brighter, okay? So after that's stirred together, then you're going to strain it. Make sure you get all your product. Oh, the vanilla bean itself, the pod, you can rinse this off if you want and add it to a container of sugar. Let it set for about a week, and then the sugar will have a vanilla flavor to it. So you can reuse these. All right, so what happens if I add a hot anglaise to my cold whipped cream? It'll melt the whipped cream, okay? So what temperature do I need my anglaise to be before I add it to my whipped cream? Andy told you what temperature, would you say? 75 to 85 degrees, correct. What happens if my cream or my anglaise is about 70 degrees? It'll set too fast and I'm going to get lumps, okay? So even if it looks fluid, if it's only at 70 degrees, you want to make sure that you warm it up to 75 to 85 degrees. Because by the time you add all of it, it's going to be setting up and you're going to get lumps, okay? Very important to check the temperature. All right, so with us adding so much liquid to it, it really doesn't take long for this to cool down, which it's already at 89 degrees. All right, so I'm going to put a wet towel underneath the whipped cream bowl at my base. So it's about 85 degrees. I'm going to cool it down just a little bit. So putting it on the ice bath. That's a good to, there we go, it's in the 70s now. All right, so my rule of thumb is always pour thin into thick, okay? If I try to add my whipped cream into my anglaise, I'm going to get whipped cream lumps, okay? But if I slowly add my anglaise into my whipped cream and I'm folding as I go, so slowly add a little bit at a time and fold it in. I'm going to have a nice, smooth Bavarian filling, okay? So no matter what the recipe tells you, think about it. If it makes sense to do thin and a thick, do thin and a thick. I cannot think of a time where this didn't apply. So folding a little bit in at a time, not to go too fast. If you go too fast, you're going to get whipped cream lumps also. And you don't want to be folding it forever. So I'm probably adding about 2 or 3 ounces of the anglaise at a time. Folding it in until I can almost not see it. It's almost one smooth color before I add a little bit more. And now this is getting pretty thin, so I can add the rest of it. I don't have to go as slow. And one even color, and make sure you don't have any whipped cream on your rubber spatula. What you're going to do next is you're going to get your cake. I need you to have a ruler. What I want you to do is I want you to measure from the top of the chinoise to the top of the acetate. Okay? So the top of the chinoise to the top of the acetate. And I'm going to use centimeters because it's just going to make my life easier because you're going to divide it in half. Right? So what I want you to do is take a ruler and pay attention. My ruler starts at the end counting. Some of them have that little bit where you don't. So just take that into consideration when you're working with it. So I'm going to go from the top of the chinoise to the top of the acetate. And I'm right at 5 centimeters. Okay? So I'm going to go and I'm going to mark about 2.5 centimeters. And leave a little mark inside my jacquard biscuit. And I don't take my eyes off of it because I'll lose it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill my raspberry Bavarian to that mark. So what we want to see at the end is we want to see a perfectly even layer, and a half will be raspberry and the other half is going to be vanilla. And when we pour, it's kind of mounding. So we want to give it a little bit of time to flatten out. And if you need to, hold on to the cardboard and the mold and kind of tap it. I'm going to give it just a little bit more, not much. and make sure that's level, okay? You gotta pull up the plastic wrap again. Be careful not to bend the acetate. And we're gonna pop this in the blast chiller and let it set up before we make our vanilla Bavarian, okay? Vanilla Bavarian, and since it's pretty much the same as what I've already shown you, I'd already started working on it. I already whipped my whipped cream and got it into a bowl. I already whisked together my yolks and my sugar, and I actually had already brought to a boil my cream and my milk along with the vanilla bean. Just a reminder, it's okay to change out your sanitizing bucket every once in a while. So I brought my milk and cream to a boil with the vanilla bean. And take my towel, put it in a circular motion. Not circular motion. So with these pots, if you guys have a hard time holding them and twisting your wrist, just grab underneath. It's much easier on your wrist, and then you can just slowly add it this way. So with whenever you're cooking on a double boiler, the faster it'll cook a little bit faster if you have a wide mouth pot with a lot of steam, and the bowl is large as well, so you have more steam cooking surface area. Okay. If you have a small bowl or a small pot and a large bowl, you're only going to get a little area where it's going to cook. This one's going to take a little bit longer because we have twice the liquid in here. So we're still going to the 175, but because we have the milk and the cream in here, it's going to take a little bit longer. So again, making sure that you have that larger space is important. Okay, turn it down to like 5. So the important thing about the temperature to turn it down to, it's not so much what the number is, it's more about how much steam is coming out. You want to make sure you have steam heat in the bottom of the bowl, but you don't want so much coming out that you're going to burn yourself from the excess steam, okay? So a little bit of steam is okay, but not too much. So what temperature am I cooking it to? And why do we cook it so high? Kills the bacteria, but at what temperature? Around 130, right? So why all the way up to 175? To help it thicken. So stirring it cools it down also. So, all right. You turn it off, move it to the side. We're going to take our last 4 gelatin sheets. Squeeze out the excess water. Make sure we dissolve it. This time we got more liquid. So, we got more liquid that's been heated to 175 and less liquid that we're adding in to cool it. So it's going to take a little bit longer to cool it down. But we're going to start with, make sure the gelatin is dissolved. If you don't hydrate the gelatin properly or dissolve it properly, when you go to put it in your Bavarian, after, when it sets up, you'll actually see a thicker piece of darker whatever. So like if it's the raspberry, it'd be redder. And if it's this, it'll be a darker egg color and not so light. And that'll be the gelatin setting up. So it's very important to make sure you, 1, hydrate it properly, and 2, dissolve it properly. Okay? What happens to gelatin if you bring it to a boil? You decrease the strength of the gelatin. I'm bringing back all your theory stuff back for you guys. All right, so it's very important. I've seen like of the time you don't, and the reason is for the strength. You want to keep the strength, okay? All right, so I'm going to take my anglaise and I'm going to strain it. Again, if you wanted to, you could clean that vanilla bean and make your vanilla sugar. And then you're going to keep the ice and you're going to use this to help cool down your anglaise to what temperature? 75 to 85. And that's only because we're doing a gelatin-based product. So depending on what you're doing, the temperature will change. So in that what you should know before you graduate chart, it talks about that, okay? So different things have different temperatures. It's just this is gelatin, so that's why that's what it is. And then just like when you cook the anglaise, if you leave it on without stirring it, it'll coagulate, it'll set up from the gelatin on this. So make sure you're stirring it as you're working on it. And as it gets close, don't leave it on as long. So if I get this down to 70, what am I going to do? I'm going to heat it up. But it's still fluid. Do I still need to heat it up? Why? Renee. Great. It might look fluid, but it'll still set up on you. Okay? Anytime I think, it'll be fine, I always learn to regret it. So take the time to do it right the first time, and that way you won't have to fix the mistake later. So make sure you dry the bottom of the bowl so that when you're adding to the whipped cream, you don't get water drips. And which one's going into which? Thin into thick. Why? So you don't get whipped cream lumps, okay? Always fold with a large rubber spatula. Less work for you. So a little bit at a time. Folding it. If you go too fast and you get whipped cream lumps, you can hit it with the whisk really light to break up those whipped cream lumps. But I didn't see anybody with whipped cream lumps, so good job. Alright, so my whipped cream's getting pretty thin, so I can go ahead and add the remaining. Make sure you get everything out of there. And if it's really thin, it's okay to go ahead and put it back on the ice bath once when it's together. But don't leave it there for too long, okay? But it won't take long for it to start to thicken up. This time, you're going to take off the plastic wrap and get rid of it. You're not going to need it again. And what you want to do before you add the vanilla onto the raspberry, you want to make sure that the raspberry is set. Okay? If it's fluid and I pour the vanilla on there, it's going to go into the raspberry and kind of look swirly, which we don't want. I'm going to be grading you on flat and level. Okay? It's too easy to make swirly. So you just touch the center, and it should feel gelatinous. It's still sticky. That's okay. All right, but it's not liquid. And so as long as it's not liquid, we're good. Okay? All right. So we're going to pour this on. And notice I stayed low when I poured it on, because even if it's a little bit soft, sometimes it'll go down the center. So if you keep it low, then it shouldn't. And then this time we're going to go to the top of the acetate. Again, remember when you pour, it kind of bubbles out, and you gotta wait for it to flatten out. So go a little bit under. Get room for just a little bit more. All right, so once when you think you have it where you need it, you're gonna take your serrated slicer because it's nice and long. You're gonna start from the center and pull out. And then go the opposite direction to make sure you don't have too much in there, okay? I don't want you to cover it because if you cover it, you're gonna leave a mark from the plastic wrap. And if we do that, then you're gonna be able to see it for the last part, okay? So this is gonna go back into the blast chiller. We're gonna quickly do our dishes, and then I'm gonna show you the glaçage, and then we're gonna clean up. All right, so for the glaçage, I just like this recipe. It's really easy to work with, so that's why I switched it from the glaze. The glaze in Andy's book works, but I just think this is easier. So this is from Wayne's book. If you didn't write down the page number, it's page 428. And if you just wanted something clear with nothing in it, you could do this with just water. Doing the raspberry, you could change any fruit puree to make it complement. Wayne also has a chocolate glaze, and he has a coffee glaze as well. So you got some options with it. And then we're going to add our gelatin sheets. That's 5 gelatin sheets, right? So we're going to squeeze out the excess water. And I hope you guys all have your gelatin sheets in the water. If you don't, then you're going to want to make sure that you let them sit for about 15 minutes before you continue, okay? So you're going to take your 5 gelatin sheets, add them to the hot liquid. While that's dissolving, you can take your raspberry puree and add it to a bowl. So let the gelatin sheets dissolve, and once when you think they're dissolved, how long are you going to wait? Wait a minute. Why? Just to make sure. So I am going to need my ice bath. So I'm going to get rid of some of this water so I don't make a mess. So notice I don't have a whisk, okay? I'm trying to keep air bubbles from forming, okay? So the less I add to it, the better chance I'll have of having fewer air bubbles. And then I will just add that straight to the puree. And then to clean this, you want to fill it up with water and bring it to boil to make sure all the gelatin comes off of it, okay? All right, so we're just going to stir this, keeping the rubber spatula underneath the liquid as I'm stirring to decrease the likelihood of air bubbles forming. You're going to have some. We're just trying to keep it to a minimum. You don't want to strain this because that would increase air bubbles as well. So think of when you sift your flour, you're lightening it up, right? So we don't want to strain it. And then what temperature do you think we want this to be before we put it on? So what temperature was our unglaze before we added it to whipped cream? Between 75 and 85, right? Because we didn't want it to melt the whipped cream. Well, we still don't want it to melt the whipped cream. So that's still good temperature, right? And as it's cooling down, it's more likely to form air bubbles. So again, make sure you keep the rubber spatula underneath the liquid to reduce that as much as possible. All right. So you got all these little air bubbles. Can you see them? Okay. So we want to get rid of those because we don't want them to be in on the top of our Bavarian. So we're going to just get a spoon and remove as much of them as possible. You won't get rid of all of them. We're just going to try our best to get rid of what we can. And then this time what you're gonna do is you're going to pour it in a circular motion in the center. Take a torch and very lightly hit the air bubbles to make them pop. This will only pop the big air bubbles. It won't really help with those really small ones, okay? You also don't want to have too much heat because you're going to make it so that you'll warm up your Bavarian and then that will start to come to the surface, okay? So make sure your Bavarian's set, which mine was, and then pour it on. Hit it with the torch just to smooth out a little bit. And then as soon as you're done, you're gonna lift this up, leaving on the acetate, okay? You take it home with the acetate on. So leave the acetate on. Clean off the excess glaze here. And then put it in the refrigerator.